You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City, and today I'm joined by a special guest. Joining me today is Dr. Van Jackson, an American political scientist and former Pentagon official, currently a senior lecturer in international relations at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Van is the author of the 2018 book On the Brink, Trump, Kim, and the Threat of Nuclear War, and I spent a good amount of time with this book, reading it after its release, and I got to say it was a nice way, Van, to relive a little bit of the trauma of 2017 as somebody that spent a lot of time writing about North Korea. But look, I'm really glad to have you on the show today. We're actually hitting an interesting milestone. I think you're our first guest we've had on from New Zealand, so that's a fun milestone. And also, I should note that Van used to write for The Diplomat a few years ago, where he opined on North Korean issues, in the good old days before North Korea had an ICBM, and the United States felt a lot more comfortable flying bombers over their near their territory all the time. Although that didn't stop in 2017 necessarily. But Van, without further ado, I'm happy to have you on to talk about your book. I think it's a really great first draft of history, sort of telling of 2017. So reading your book, I sort of walked away with I think I caught your core thesis, which was that the crisis dynamics with North Korea were always, in a sense, coming to a head as it pursued the realization of its capabilities, right? So since the January 2013 declaration of Kim Jong-un of the Byungjin Line, which was the simultaneous pursuit of a nuclear deterrent and economic development, North Korea was kind of heading towards the finish line of mastering its physics package with the thermonuclear bomb. They showed that off in September 2017 when they created a magnitude 6 seismic event under Punggye-ri, under Mount Montop at Punggye-ri, and also the delivery vehicle aspect of their program, the Intercontinental Range Ballistic Missile. And we just happened to have Donald Trump in office at the time, but I think you actually say this in the book that, regardless of who had been president, that this was always coming to a head. And it's just that the unique factors that the Trump administration brought to the office made things so much more dangerous. So tell us a bit about, what you first of all think of that assessment of what went on in 2017. And we'll continue the conversation from there. But, is that a fair assessment that this was really kind of coming to a head around this timing, and the fact that we had Donald Trump in office just made things so much more dangerous?
Yeah, that's spot on, actually. Like, the right way to think of what happened. I mean, so we were on the brink, right? Closest we came to nuclear war since Cuban Missile Crisis. That's kind of the log line. But the right way to think about it is that there were these historical processes that were sort of in train. And because of underlying strategic conflicts of interest about nukes especially, we were on a collision course. And that really, it became clear in the Obama administration, especially in the latter half, that the U.S. was sort of locked in. The Washington establishment was entrenched on its position, right? Comprehensive denuclearization. If we were going to have diplomacy, it was going to be six-party talks. It was basically the only format that was going to be acceptable. And that narrowing of the imagination of policy possibilities made us completely contrary to anything that North Korea could abide. So you have like 60 years of hostility, of bad intentions, of failed diplomacy, where both sides feel like they've been burned. Lots of bellicose rhetoric and threat making, primarily on the North Korean side, especially in recent decades. And then it just so happens that a millennial takes power in North Korea and Trump takes power in the U.S. They both inherit a shitty situation. And they at that point, they start to matter. But the situation is so shitty that, and I spend a whole chapter on this, as you know, even if it was a Hillary Clinton presidency, it's very plausible, even likely, that there would have been a nuclear crisis. You're not going to have things under a normal sort of generic vanilla president alternative. You're not going to have fire and fury. You're not going to have a lot of the craziness. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. You're not going to have the war scare that brought us to the brink. But you are still primed for crisis. You still have, threat making and deploying nuclear bombers and such against a nuclear armed adversary. And it's a nuclear armed adversary that's getting more desperate because it needs sanctions relief. It needs economic development. And so that's where we find ourselves now. So this crisis was a product of historical trends. It's just something that Trump and Kim basically inherited. And then they both made the best of it, but they made the best of it for themselves. And that's kind of like a subtext or a theme that I don't get to focus on except at the very end because of how quickly all this stuff happened relative to when I published the book.
Yeah, I mean, your writing process was actually quite interesting. I mean, you were live blogging your book writing process. How long did it go from, the first words going down on the page to you submitting your manuscript?
Yeah, so that's a funny story. So I was live blogging this, God, starting I think like early December 2017, and my Cambridge University Press had published my first book, and my editor, I thought I was sort of like going to do stuff that had nothing to do with North Korea for research, and then my editor came to me in the middle of the crisis, like shortly after Fire and Fury commentary, and she was like, "Hey, what do you make of this crisis?" And I sort of gave her my spiel about here are the dangers, here's what's wrong, here's how everything could sort of explode. And then she's like, what do you think about writing a book on that? And I was like, well, that'd be great. You're Cambridge. And then she's like, but you got to do it quick. I was like, how quick? And she's like 6 months quick. And I was like, that's fast for, like 80, 90,000 words. But I was at a point where I needed a bigger canvas to sort of express my concern, because there was like I could see more than one pathway to war happening for like more than one reason. And so like, if you're just writing op-eds or commenting in the media, everything is sort of decontextualized. So you can only fit in like soundbite explanations for how things could go wrong. But I could see way more that could go wrong that was sort of unconnected to the news cycle. And so like I needed a canvas that was bigger than an op-ed or bigger than a, hit on CNN. And the book became that canvas. And then the live blogging was a way of like sort of just reflecting on what was happening, producing fodder for myself to use in the book. Because I'm sort of like I'm basically like reading your Twitter feed as the crisis is happening to pull content for the book and like write about it and analyze it as it's happening. So the blog was sort of a feeder for my writing process. And because it was public, it was allowing me to sort of maintain self-accountability or public accountability for my writing, because I needed to be disciplined to produce this many words in such a short period of time.
That's right.
So it was like I basically wrote every day for 6 months.
Yeah.
And what was it like? I think I was averaging like maybe 500 or 600 words a weekday.
Wow.
And then less weekends.
I mean, it must have been crazy frustrating, recounting the crisis of 2017 as, I guess you were doing most of your writing in early 2018 when we were hurtling towards Singapore. And, all of a sudden the narrative shifted that, we had peace in our time and Donald Trump was a great genius who was going to end this crisis on the spot at the Capella Hotel in Singapore. And now they've fallen in love. So I can't imagine how maddening that must have been for you, kind of, recounting this history and really underlying the structural factors that are very much, still present today. And we'll get to that in a bit. But, just to stay on the book for a bit. And, this is all recent history, and, I don't want to spoil stuff for listeners, because ideally the point of this podcast is that people should go out and get your book. I actually, I think it's a great telling. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, though, is that you do I really enjoyed your retelling of the Obama years of the U.S.-North Korea relationship. That's a history that hasn't really been treated in too many books so far. I mean, every book on North Korea includes a retelling of the history of the Cold War era, the 1990s, the Agreed Framework, the collapse, if we get to the later books published in the late 2000s and so forth. But I thought your telling of the Obama years was interesting, right? And I think we've talked about this a bit on Twitter, that the Obama administration was effectively faced with two non-proliferation crises. You had Iran and North Korea. And a lot of the eggs and a lot of the political capital ended up being spent on the Iran problem, which was in a very different place as far as capabilities are concerned compared to North Korea. For example, Iran had never tested a nuclear device before the Obama administration came into office. And, I think Ben Rhodes had that line that no country became the first to test a nuclear device during the Obama presidency for a while. So that's an interesting data point, but not sure it tells us a lot. But, looking back at that, was it sort of, was there a point in the Obama administration, and I think you get at this in the book, that the decision effectively to go all in on Iran and basically pass the hot potato on North Korea on to the successor administration, presuming that it would have been a Hillary Clinton and not a Donald Trump. I think, in my reading, that seems to be kind of one of the things I walk away with. And I know it's, more nuanced in reality. Obviously, I'm not saying that the Obama administration didn't take North Korea seriously. I think they did. Kim Jong-il dying in 2011, I think also had an effect on what was attainable with Kim Jong-un's internal power consolidation project. But what do you make of all that?
I think the line I have, or the line that I tell people, I don't know if I put it in the book, was like, the Obama administration treated North Korea seriously, but not urgently. And it was taking on an urgent it was becoming an urgent issue because of how we had positioned ourselves policy-wise, because we had this line of denuclearization and sort of zero tolerance on nukes, and we had this ally which at the time was sort of very aggressive toward North Korea, and we were trying to keep up allies. One side note, I had 2 extra chapters written. I actually fully wrote them on the Obama era. The publisher had them removed because they wanted to like get to the Trump stuff quicker for the reader.
Yeah.
And because ultimately 2 extra chapters increases the price of the book. And so for the sake of like sales, and reviews, I guess, we cut 2 chapters that I have like sitting in my pocket still, not really sure what to do with. So like there's more history on the Obama era that I wrote that is not even in the book. Basically Obama had decided, he said publicly in an interview on, of all places, YouTube, in 2015, that there was no military solution on North Korea. Bob Woodward's book talks about like they were looking at options in 2016. Like yes and no. That's not untrue, but like looking at options is sort of a recurring thing that you do in government. So like it's not as provocative as Woodward put it forward to be. And Obama and I think Susan Rice they had ruled out actually striking North Korea, even though in that final year of the administration, shit was getting really intense. Like the situation was getting very acute. And on January 10th, 2017, so we already know Trump's coming into office at that point, John Kerry, the doviest dove of doves, he gives a speech at like the U.S. Naval Academy where he says that, if North Korea keeps developing its ballistic missile program, we may have to hit them. And if you like go and look back at the op-eds, like public discourse about North Korea in that late 2016 period, it was all about blowing North Korea up. Like, do we need to have a preventive war? Do we need to strike them? It was basically like priming everybody for those became the threads that the Trump administration and Trump himself picked up on later. Mm-hmm. So like the whole bloody nose thing, that's some very colorful terminology, but like in concept, people were already publicly talking about that in 2016. And so like the groundwork sort of intellectually, emotionally, psychologically for 2017 was laid down in 2016. And it was made even worse by the fact that like we were launching targeted sanctions for the first time ever against Kim Jong-un as a person, against his regime elites. And we were really squeezing them hard. We weren't talking to them. And so like, if you're handing that situation to like a responsible statesman and you have like a Hillary Clinton come in, you know what you're doing with that, like, who you're handing it to. And so you can just sort of punt and be like, look, we'll go all in on Iran, like you said. But then, obviously Clinton didn't win, and the situation was what it was. Like, this was a situation that could only be handled well by somebody who had the savvy of like genuine statesmanship and subject matter expertise and rigorous process. And we didn't get that. So we got this sort of explosive thing that took us to the brink unnecessarily. But, part of that was just the fluke of history because Obama thought he was handing a like super acute hardline policy to Clinton, not to Trump.
Yeah, and there was that interview during the transition when Obama met Trump in the White House, and Trump walked away with at least what he claimed was an appreciation for how serious the North Korea problem was from Obama directly. Um,
Yeah.
and, you know, I mean, a lot of, as somebody that was writing about all of this stuff, and particularly on the North Korean capability side in 2017, I think what, really made things really scary is that not only did you have an explosive president in the White House known for all sorts of capricious decision making, but North Korea was effectively at the most dangerous point of nuclear development for any nuclear state, right? If you want to go back to Scott Sagan's work in the 1990s of nuclear development, North Korea had figured out the physics package and the delivery vehicles, but things like command and control, organizational structure, actually deploying these systems, its complete effective blindness to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, like they don't really know what the United States is doing around the peninsula, right? I mean, you retell the story in the book of the Carl Vinson saga when North Korean state media, bought into the PACOM public affairs line that this carrier was in the Sea of Japan, and they started condemning it. And we found out a few days later that it was, I think, in the South China Sea. I mean, it was all
Dude,
of these things.
If you're Kim Jong-un, and think about that, right?
Yeah.
So if you have an aircraft carrier in the vicinity, that's an indicator of imminent war. It's
Right.
not the indicator, right? But that's you. If you're North Korea, you look for that, and then and it's easy enough to know when an aircraft carrier is in the area. Except this time you don't see it. You're like, where the hell is it? Where the hell is it? Like, oh my God, the president just said there's an aircraft carrier going to be parked off of our coast. We can't freaking find it. Like the risk built into that situation for no damn reason other than bad coordination of press releases and people at the lower levels parroting, repeating, mindlessly the people at the upper levels what they say regardless of fact. Like that was a mini crisis in itself, completely unnecessary, completely avoidable. And North Korea, Kim Jong-un would have been completely rational if he would have launched some kind of preemptive, in his mind, preemptive strike, thinking that there's an invisible aircraft carrier that's about to land,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I worry about a lot with North Korea is their limited ISR capabilities. I mean, it's part of the reason why they're so paranoid about, bomber flights. You talk about that. I mean, I think, your book actually makes for a pretty good paired reading with, Jeffrey Lewis's work of fiction, the 2020 Commission, where he actually games out some of these scenarios and how the North Koreans might behave under the uncertainty of decision-making in many of these scenarios. I mean, reading your book, I mean, I did, come away with an appreciation for just how crazy 2017 must have been for, North Korean analysts that are trying to make sense of the Trump administration. And we have good evidence now that they've actually done a pretty good job of understanding what makes this White House tick. I mean, much better than certainly vice versa, the Trump administration's understanding of Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. I mean, they continuously praise Trump, and they point out that they want to talk to him and not his deputies. It's really interesting. And obviously the North Koreans, I mean, they're reading our tweets, they're reading our news articles. I mean, really everything, from that Kerry speech that you talked about to all the press coverage of these PACOM releases on carrier presence, obviously Donald Trump's tweets. All of these things are sort of factoring into North Korea's informational universe, even if actual things like military deployments and movements around the peninsula are less perceivable to them, which is why, they're so paranoid about things like strategic assets and submarines and bombers and all that. So that's really, I think, an interesting thing that I took away reliving.
That's why the rhetoric, people treat Trump's rhetoric well, it's just cheap talk. Oh, he wasn't serious. He's just trying to move the needle. He was never going to really bomb North Korea or whatever. One of the reasons why Trump's fire and fury rhetoric was so dangerous was because all of the material military movement kind of indicators of war that North Korea looks for. Because if North Korea thinks a war is about to happen, they're going to strike first. They've told us that. That's what makes sense strategically in their position.
Right.
So that's what they'll do. So then they're looking for what are these indicators of war. The problem with the Korea setup is that by the Obama administration, all the material indicators of war are set up. And Vipin makes this point a lot. Kim Jong-un doesn't have any indicators of war. The thing that made Obama stable, despite all of these material indicators of war being prepped, right? Bomber deployments, exercises, carriers, stealth fighters on the peninsula. The reason why it was stable sort of anyway was because there wasn't the political rhetoric that accommodated a first strike on North Korea. When you change that rhetoric, you change the space of what's possible. And so Trump's fire and fury rhetoric, when you match that with all of the actual material indicators of war, then if, from North Korea's perspective, you've got nothing. You've got like every single day you wake up and you could be like, well, this is it, you know? And you don't want a nascent nuclear adversary that's on the ropes to be feeling like this is it, you know?
Right, right. I mean, okay, so moving forward a bit to present events. So basically, I think since June 13th, we haven't really had much progress between the United States and North Korea. I think that's pretty stark, and I think if you look at what the North Koreans said on June 13th in KCNA when they paraphrased Kim Jong-un's views of the Singapore summit and what Kim Jong-un just said during his New Year's Day address, very little has changed. They're waiting for corresponding measures. They're not going to get corresponding measures. We're in a position where we're relying effectively on Donald Trump's love, quote unquote, for Kim Jong-un to basically carry us through to another U.S. administration without a major crisis. That doesn't seem to be particularly a recipe for stability. As we just started taping this podcast, there were reports that Kim Jong-un is reportedly on a train over to Beijing again. And, I think he's made it pretty clear that the North Koreans don't have an unlimited amount of patience waiting for the United States to kind of go away from its all or nothing approach. One of the things, I wanted to ask you a bit about as a former Pentagon guy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense was specifically about Mattis. He comes across as an important figure in your book, particularly as a foil to H.R. McMaster, Trump's former national security advisor, who was among those who made public remarks suggesting that Kim Jong-un wasn't subject to, classical deterrence theory, implying that he was irrational and needed to be dealt with accordingly. With Mattis's departure and this process sort of entering potentially a new phase, I don't know, leading up to the second summit, if we even get there or if things fall apart before then. How much do you worry about Mattis, no longer being there and his presumptive successor being somebody more in line with the president's own thinking?
Man, that's a really good question. If Shanahan's the current acting Secretary of Defense, and he's basically going to be a puppet for Trump, but he's not trying to push Trump into attacking or anything, right? So I'd be much more worried if a John Bolton type or a Tom Cotton type or Lindsey Graham ended up in the Secretary of Defense slot. That is scary because then you have every meaningful position in the interagency occupied by, a neocon or warmonger, whatever you want to call it. And at that point, they can manipulate processes to push Trump into whatever they want. Right. And if we know anything about Trump, it's that he's eminently manipulable. And so that would be my big concern post Mattis, is that you get a sort of neocon in there. Shanahan is military industrial complex guy, but he's not a policy person. He's not John Bolton. So it's not great because he's not, if Trump decides he wants to do a strike or if Bolton whispers in his ear, then Shanahan's just going to execute, whereas Mattis might have found some crafty way to stall. So it's a marginally worse situation post Mattis, but I would only really freak out if you had a Tom Cotton type or a Lindsey Graham type in there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You referenced our mutual friend Vipin Narang earlier. He has a great line about what's going on right now, which is denuclearization by denial. You usually hear about deterrence by denial, but effectively making the claim that Trump, like so many things, doesn't care about denuclearization, non-proliferation. North Korea actually, coming back to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. For him, it's really about getting this out of the news cycle, getting the the positive publicity, and I think some people have taken that a little bit further to kind of imply that we'll make it through this crisis just fine, because even as leaks come out of the intel community that North Korea is continuing to enrich, has covert enrichment sites, is continuing to deploy and build missiles, as long as they don't test anything, as long as the testing moratorium sticks, we'll be okay. But obviously, again, going back to the Obama days, we have, the fallout of the Leap Day agreement with the satellite launch, something that's still imaginable in the North Korean context. Even if they follow through with dismantling Sohae, which they've said they will do, they could still launch, mobile satellites if they needed to, or something like that. So the prospect of a provocation, potentially one of the things Kim Jong-un meant when he alluded kind of cryptically to a new way in his New Year's Day address, remains on the table. And of course, there's the possibility then that that gives ammunition to the John Boltons in the administration. Just as Bolton wrote in 2002 that he had, or 2005, that he had the hammer to destroy the agreed framework with the discovery of North Korea hedging its plutonium program with the uranium program. So today could be, another missile test, which North Korea has incentives to do if they're serious about being a nuclear state. They need to practice operational readiness and launches just like every other state with ballistic missiles does. So how much?
I think a missile test is what pushes Trump. Like if Trump is wedded to his current narrative because he thinks it's in the like Hannity, Daily Caller, Fox sort of bubble, that narrative of like Trump saved the day on North Korea is still being reified. So like he's still milking dividends off of that view of North Korea policy, even though it's completely divorced from reality. And I think it's only a missile test or a nuke test that would jar him out of that. And the problem, as you say, is that like Kim Jong-un, based on the New Year's Day speech and based on his actual sort of, technical milestones, would benefit from doing more missile tests. They sort of need to do that at some point. It's probably going to happen. And Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech sort of implied that, like, look, if you don't come around on sanctions relief, the other shoe will drop, and the other shoe has missiles in it. Like that seems to be like where we're headed right now. And it's only a summit that will sort of delay that. Mm-hmm. But even then, how much it delays it depends on what Kim gets out of the summit itself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and the core message from the New Year's speech was effectively that we've moved and now it's your turn to go. And it doesn't look like the Trump administration is getting any closer to really appreciating that message. But they have ways to be crafty about this too. Like maybe one of the things we take away from the 2012 experience is that the North Koreans first released a NOTAM, right? They announced that we will launch a satellite at this day without just launching a satellite in the middle of the night and having people wake up to the news that North Korea has conducted a ballistic missile test. So I think that kind of messaging from North Korea might be something we start to see. I mean, especially, we are getting up to the full legal key resolve joint exercises, and North Korea, I think, just today, again, lashed out at those military exercises, calling on South Korea not to go ahead with them. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a pretty interesting run up to this second summit if it happens, but doesn't really seem like we're going to get much closer to any real change. But Van, to close out the podcast, I wanted to ask you for kind of a prescriptive note. I think that you and I have a pretty similar view of North Korea policy. So maybe this is just me wanting to hear things that I like to hear. But what do you think should be done here?
Well, now I think that we should all just encourage the Trump administration to sit on its hands. There's no deal that you can reach under a Trump administration that Kim Jong-un is going to honor with the expectation that future administrations will carry it through. Like, Trump is not a credible, reliable actor. And foreign leaders like Kim Jong-un have already made book on Trump, right? They figured him out psychologically way before we all did, it seems like. And they've been manipulating him. They encourage Xi Jinping too, Putin, all these guys. They cultivate chemistry, personal chemistry with Trump. They create the bromance, like, it's so good for America that Trump has a great personal relationship with these guys. Bullshit. They claim a good personal relationship, but then you have unprecedented Russian hacking. You have an escalating China trade war. You have North Korea continuing with its nuclear and missile programs, like undaunted, unrestrained still, except in testing. And so like this personal chemistry doesn't seem to be paying off for America at all. And that implies to me that these guys, foreign leaders, have figured out Trump. And so they're going to manipulate him. They know he's an anomaly relative to Washington. They know he's an anomaly relative to the American public, right? Relative to North Korea experts everywhere, that they're not going to make themselves strategically vulnerable to this guy, knowing that he's only temporary. And so, and also, side note, the politics in Washington matters. A Democratic House is going to be torturing Trump. I don't know if he makes it to the end of his first term. We'll see, but that matters. And North Korea pays a lot of attention to our politics. And so we're in a situation now where, like, I think for any meaningful purpose, Trump is a lame duck. And so we do need to pursue arms control with North Korea rather than denuclearization. I think it needs to be done by a different administration. I think doing it under Trump just sets it up for failure. It's like a poison pill.
All right. Well, Van, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you, man.
Absolutely. So for listeners, again, that's Dr. Van Jackson, who's the author of a new book, On the Brink, Trump, Kim, and the Threat of Nuclear War, which I assume is being sold anywhere where books are. So if you like what you heard, go check that out. And again, if you like what you heard on the podcast here, make sure you do subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't yet left us a review on either iTunes or Google Play, you can go ahead and do that too. That really does help get the show out there and exposed. And if you have suggestions for future guests you'd like to hear on the podcast or topics, do feel free to tweet at me or just send me an email. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.